Good afternoon. I hope that we are on. I had some little difficulty here, and I guess it wouldn't be normal if I didn't have some technical difficulty, and I apologize for that. Uh, Tonight we're going to do chapters 5 and 6. Chapter 5, as you can see, nature of organization change, and then we will go into types of change in chapter 6, individual, organization, and unit, if, for lack of a better term. I don't remember exact phrase that they use there, but that's relative. We'll get into that in just a second. So tonight, at least in chapter 5, we're going to discuss evolutionary change and revolutionary change. And there are a couple of case studies in your text. One about the Dime Corporation, another about a corporation that's unnamed. And they differ between revolutionary change and evolutionary change. Evolutionary change is the one that we think of most often because that's what organizations and people do. Big change is difficult to think of, and it is very difficult to get our arms around and encompass and do a few other things. So while we're going to talk in this course and tonight and some of the rest of the course about revolutionary change, I want you to keep in mind that evolutionary change, and the text points this out, is what we see happen most often. I think that Burke has a little bit of a prejudice, and I don't mean it that in a bad way, toward revolutionary change. And I think that we have to accept the fact that evolutionary change is here, that we see that more often than we see the other. And so I don't want to say that evolutionary change is bad. What I want to say, and I want you to keep in your mind, is to be open about which one is better. Revolutionary change, of course, we know that's radical. That's going to change the way we do things and everything else. And evolutionary change is something we see gradually over time. You can think of Darwin's theory of evolution and the origin of the species and how he goes into evolution, and then other people who expounded upon his theory throughout the last century and a half, roughly, at how they look at it, etc. So keep an open mind. Remember that one is dramatic, the other is not quite so dramatic, but we have both. Burke says that scholars in 6 different disciplines have observed and developed different theories about radical change. Revolutionary change, radical change, same thing. And what they say is change in 3 different areas within the organization, individual, group, and or unit, and of course the organization as a whole. And then we have within scientific fields, within species that we know that are living here on Earth, and some that are no longer living on Earth, and then a grand theory. Notice what this says here. And you can read this, by the way, you can read that list we just went through on page 74. And Stephen Jay Gould, who I remember more as being a baseball enthusiast and somewhat of a scholar about baseball, even though he was a well-known in his field scholar at Harvard University, talks about change being punctuated. And he talks about things go along for a period of time in an equilibrium, and then all of a sudden you have this punctuated change, and then things go back to equilibrium. You can see that entire quote on page 74 and leads into some of the other things that we're going to talk about here. So we know that revolutionary change or radical change turns everything upside down, for lack of a better term. And we can see the way things move and have grown, pardon me, from pardon me, revolutionary or radical change. Notice the thing here, it says fundamentally modified, and I would like to change that for you to think about. Instead of saying fundamentally modified, let's say fundamentally changed. Now, yeah, if you make a change, you do modify things. I understand that, but let's keep away from that what sounds like it could be a nebulous term. We can modify things, and they won't be radical. We can modify things and just have minor changes. So let's think about this as being fundamentally changed instead of fundamentally modified. Now, these are the revolutionary change. Notice what he says here, commonalities. Individual, group, and organization. An individual, if he or she makes a radical change, they're going to change their habits. And I want you just to stop and think for a second, how difficult is that? It's not something that we can really do over a period of time. Well, excuse me, something we may do over a period of time, but not something that we think about. And so if we're going to make a radical change, it is something that really causes us a lot of problems. One that I would like to talk about is stopping smoking, because I can speak to that. I did that more than 40 years ago. It's a radical change. You don't think about that as being a radical change because it changes your body in many, many ways. And a lot of people, by the way, this is what I'm going to tell you, not ever happened to me, but a lot of people will stop smoking, and then after a period of time, and a period of time can be a month or 2 months or so, they'll start putting on weight. And they say, well, I don't understand this because I'm not eating anymore, excuse me. What they forget is that smoking changes your metabolic rate. And when you stop smoking, your metabolic rate slows down. So you're still eating the same amount of calories that you did before, but you're not burning them up because you're not putting a pollutant into your system that causes a burning of calories. And many of these people will go back to smoking. And I'm not going to tell you I didn't put on weight. I did put on weight. But it didn't come to a point where it was burdensome to me. I've since lost a lot of that weight. I went on a more rigorous exercise program than what I had done before. Group, they're talking about changing processes and tasks and things of that nature. And then here was the big thing. Your organization, when it changes, it's changing the underlying culture. Now, if you've taken organizational behavior or you've taken some other courses that talk about culture and things of that nature, this is very difficult to do because organizations define themselves to the outside world based upon their culture. This is who we are. This is what we stand for. These are our values and our norms. So that when you think about that, that's obviously very radical. Then we have the equilibrium periods. And notice what it says here, maintenance of the system. I don't know that's so much of maintenance of the system as it is just to continually the status quo. We're maintaining the status quo. Everything's on an even keel. We're not doing any rocking the boat. And then it talks here about the choosing of activities. You have to remember one thing, that continual change is not something that's natural. We don't do that as humans. Remember, I'm talking about continual change, and I'm going to contradict myself here in a second. we talk about continual change. We don't do that as humans. We can't expect organizations to do that. Now, here's what may sound like I'm contradicting myself when we talk about continuous improvement. That's a concept that was, pardon me, brought to the United States by the Japanese, actually taught to them by an American, Dr. W. Edwards Deming, after World War II. Dr. Deming was the father of total quality management. And the Japanese talk about continuous change. Continuous improvement. Now, if you continually improve something, most likely you're going to change it in some fashion. But that's considered evolutionary change. So it's not radical. And I don't want to get off that subject or just leave the subject and say, well, okay, well, I'm not going to talk about it anymore. But I want you to see the difference there. So continual change, something that we're continually doing, continually changing, is not something that we humans do on a routine basis. Continuous improvement, while that will lead to change, is not quite the same thing. Now, this again, the revolutionary change commonalities, but Gersik here is speaking again of equilibrium, equilibrium periods here, and she's narrowed resistance to what she calls 3 barriers to change: cognition, motivation, and obligation. So let's come back to these just a second. Cognition, we would know as being awareness, but not expansive. It's within a cognitive framework. Motivation, because we don't want to know about the future. Now remember, these are resistance tactics I'm going to use. And finally, obligation, back to strategizing point. How is it supposed to look? So we have to think about things in this kind of a thought process, if you will. Now, notice what Burke says here, that revolutionary periods are a jolt to the system. And I think that's a good way to look at that, because we have been in this status quo, if you will. I'll try to make this even here. My hands aren't probably even. And then all of a sudden we're going to do something, and it jolts us into a different position. Now, we can think of, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, Lewin's three stages or 3 phases of change: unfreezing, thawing out, and then refreezing. So he says here that the shock, if you will, what happens when we do this. And too often, pardon me, as you're aware, we're not prepared for the change. Even though we may have a change agent, the change has been laid out, the proper road work, if you will, proper pathway has not been smoothed out. And so we're still, in this uneven period of I'm talking here now about thought process to get ready for the change. And so it's very important, I think, not only to have, pardon me, as Burke pointed out early on, not only to have a good messenger, change agent, and that the messenger need not be defensive or shouldn't be defensive, but he or she has to clearly articulate what the vision is and acknowledge that, yes, we're going to have some detours along the way, bumps and bruises, if you will. Everything is not going to be smooth, but the desired end state is worth the trials and tribulations that we'll go through to get there. because what we have today isn't going to do what we need to be able to do tomorrow. Finally, notice this last bullet down here. If we change in the system's environment, it does threaten survival. We have to think about that. But on the other hand, if we don't change, survival is threatened just as well. Now, here we come back to evolutionary change. And notice what the slide says. The vast majority of change in organizations is evolutionary. They're considered incremental and continuous, as we mentioned before. The Japanese term is that they use for continuous change is Kaizen, which really means continuous improvement. Now, notice again, I interposed change and improvement. And I think you could probably make a safe argument that improvement is not necessarily change. I say you could do that. I don't know if it's with the whole water when you got through with it, but we can say that, and people think of it that way because something may come out and have changed, and the change is so minuscule or so unnoticeable that people just don't see it, even though it improves what they want to be able to do. And I'm thinking about an automobile where somebody's improved the acceleration ratio. And you don't think about that when you get in, unless you're a professional car driver. None of us that operate our own family vehicle, unless we have a job someplace else, are considered professional automobile people. Drivers, excuse me. We're not considered that. And so we may not notice that. And notice the last bullet, that some of the evolutionary change may be part of the larger picture or the larger change that's contemplated, which may make us or put us into revolutionary change. I'm not going to read this slide to you because you can read it yourself. And I think we have to understand that not all change is beneficial. And I remember years ago when I was younger and had not been able to vote for a long period of time. And the city where I lived then, and I still live near that city, but I don't live in it any longer, had an election for mayor and the city commission. And I was kind of tired of the old people and voted for some people to come in and make some change that I thought was needed. And when the election results came in, I think 4 of the people that I voted for on the city commission won, and out of 5, and person I wanted to win for mayor, voted for mayor, won his race. And so I was kind of bragging to my father about how successful it had been, and I'd been part of that success. And Dad just looked at me and said, "Well, the only thing you can say for certain with change is that you get change. Doesn't mean that it's better. It doesn't mean that it's worse. All you know that you're going to get is change." So those of us who are going to implement change, we have to be cognizant of that, not just because my dad said it, but be cognizant of what's here on the PowerPoint slide. That is that all change is not beneficial. And if we're going to, pardon me again, if we're going to implement change, then we have to make sure that the change we want to implement is going to be a benefit in the long term. Now, in your text is a are several case studies, and one is about the Dime Bank Corporation, and the other one is I mentioned about a company that I've read this a couple of times. It has a name, I can't find it. Now, notice what Dime did here at the beginning. It actually, and this says merger, but it actually acquired Anchor Bank. And notice what the slide says here. Anchor Bank was detail oriented, whereas Dime Bank wanted to look at the big picture. So obviously, you have a clash of cultures here. A culture of being detail oriented, and a culture of we need to look out here and see everything at one time. So ordinarily what happens, and I saw some of this in some of the postings today in regards to the discussion question about open systems, was about mergers and acquisitions and things like that, and how much turmoil they can cause. And we have to be very careful about that. So, excuse me, I skipped a slide here. We have to be very careful about that and make sure that we are cognizant of the fact that we have a clash of cultures or a potential clash of cultures and what that may mean for us. Now you can see this slide that we have here, organization surveys comparison of time 1 and 2. We have time 1 here first, and we're talking about the 4 things that were most important that came out of the survey. Notice here it came out of the survey and what the survey said, and then after they went through some changes, what came out. So work climate, motivation systems, and individual needs and values. So based upon this, notice the strongest statistical relationships. And by the way, you can see this figure 5.1 on page 83 in your text, and then they'll go to figure 5.2 and a couple other things about the Dime Corporation. So we're looking at here about the business environment, mission and strategy, individual needs and values, and motivation. Those are the strongest statistical relations with perceived performance. Now remember what we're saying here with perceived performance. And we have to remember that when we talk about perception, perception is often reality. So we have to stop and pull back and say, okay, well, if this is what people think, what they perceive, it's probably true. Even though we who commissioned the survey don't really believe that. We think it's something different, but we have to pay attention to what the people said. Now, somebody would say to the survey results, yeah, okay, that's fine, but it's actually what the people put down and then what our numbers came up with. So now we have the, again, the Dime organizational survey results. This particular one, figure 5.2, can be seen on the following page, page 84 in your text. And notice how some of these things are correlated. Matter of fact, they're not. Some of these things are all correlated to performance. And the 4 factors are the business environment, mission and strategy, motivation, and individual needs and values. All of those impact on the performance of the organization and, by extension, the performance of the individuals. So we have to grasp that. We have to make sure we see that. And we have to make sure that we act upon that because we commissioned the survey. We got the survey results, and the survey results may have told us something that we didn't think was right. But that's what our people told us. And so then it's what we need to act on. So we have individual needs, and this is, by the way, this particular slide, figure 5.3 is on the following page, page 85, and we have a couple of different slides that will depict this. And these two that we have here are individual needs and motivation. And we can see what the minuses are. Balance between work and personal life is a minus. But there's one minus down here I think that we ought to really pay attention to. And the one right beneath it that sort of contradicts it. And that's number 114, people are empowered to act. There's a minus there. But in 115, authority/attitude to do the job is a positive. Now, to my mind, those things are contradictory. If you empower people, you should be giving them authority to act. So what it says here to me is that people are given authority to do something, but in another sense, that empowerment is pulled away from them. So this is a real concern here, and we have to Dime Corporation, not we, Dime Corporation has to pay attention to that. So let's look at some of the factors that contributed to Dime's initial and continuing effectiveness. Now, this is initial and continuing effectiveness after, pardon me, after the merger, the acquisition. Notice here the CEO took a leading role, not only in supporting change, but modeling the behavior that he or she expected. Enlightened HR leader and staff. Key changes made among top executives. Now, that would be interesting. And then significant acquisitions of new businesses. So Dime Corporation could have done some things that were very radical, changing key executives. They could have helped people retire early. They could have brought in new people, and most likely did. They could have eliminated some of the folks from the bank they acquired because they didn't fit. So all of those need to be thought of. And by the way, because this was a change, buying a bank that had different culture, remember we said that at the beginning, we have to ask ourselves, was there proper planning that went through this thought about merger, acquisition? Excuse me. Now we're going to look at evolutionary change in a small professional services partnership. And we go through this and we see different and sundry things here. What their values were here on the left-hand side, and then what their behavioral practices were on the right side. Now, let's just skip down here a couple. Work effectively in teams, promotes an atmosphere of teamwork. That's what they want. That's what they did. And then developing, mentoring, and training others. Plans, reviews, personnel development goals jointly with associates. So we can see some of this in table 5.1 on pages 92 and 93. So this is the things that they wanted to do, but as you read the case study, the partners were not comfortable in doing some of these things. So they went out and they used some different tools to help them develop the change that they needed to develop, and a few things of that nature. The Myers-Briggs type indicator, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, maybe even have taken, MBTI, neo-personality inventory, and the leadership assessment inventory, which some of you may have taken if you've taken the leadership theory and practice of leadership. I couldn't, of course, I couldn't think of it right off the bat. Now, I would like to stop back here for a second and talk about the MBTI and tell you that I think it's a very useful tool, but you have to be careful in using it, because as people answer this, while their tendencies happen to be, for the most part, in the areas where they answered, they're answering based upon their current level of understanding, experience, a few other things, and how they particularly feel that day. So it's possible that they could change. Now, that possibility is particularly noticeable when you're at an area that's very close between one area of MBTI and another area. People who are very strong in areas in MBTI about being either introvert or extrovert, or intuition, or thinking and sensing and things of that nature. If they're very strong in those, they're probably going to continue to be strong in those. Make sure that you get someone who is, if you're going to use this to help foment change, implement change, make sure you get someone who knows how to administer the test and someone who knows how to interpret the test. Don't try to give it on your own. I'm not suggesting that you would, but if that's a temptation, don't do that. And it also sometimes a temptation when you get the results to pigeonhole people. Be careful about doing that. Certainly some people will be better off in other areas. And you should give them the opportunity to move to those areas. But be careful about forcing things simply based upon the results of the MBTI. Now let's look at some of the results of the assessment. Notice what they were. They really did well in serving their clients and in creating professional relationships. Reasonable amount of teamwork. But look at this next one, which we go back to that table, and it says, now let's refresh your memory, developing the value, developing, mentoring, and training others. That was the value. And the behavior was plans and reviews personal development goals jointly with associates. But look what the results were. The lack of attention to mentoring and providing professional development for those who wish to move up in positions of authority, or wish to move up to positions of authority. So while they said, this is the corporate partners, while they said this is what we do, this is our value, and this is our behavioral practice, actually was not in practice. And last, let's look at this one, go back to leading and managing, provides a vision of the future that captures the commitment of people. Well, they could have provided a vision, but there wasn't much in the way of motivation for the partners to be leaders. And so now a lot of people are uncomfortable with that. A lot of people think that, well, okay, if they see what I'm doing, they'll follow me. And you don't exactly do the things that you need to do. And so there's some loss in translation, body work or whatever it happens to be. Body actions, I should say, body language. I'll get to it in a second. So in in my estimation, what was happening here was they were sending, pardon me, a mixed message. This is what we profess to do, but what we really do is something much different. So this is the evolutionary change that we come up with here. Notice the first statement up here at the top. The firm was not in trouble. So it probably could have continued doing the things it was doing and remained successful for a period of time. I didn't say long term because it appears to me that, and I think it should appear to you, that they probably wouldn't have been successful over a long period of time because there was no commitment to leadership. And, well, people weren't motivated to be leaders. So something would have happened and a vacuum would have been created. And unless you had someone who had enough moxie, pardon me, to step into the vacuum, it would have continued the way it was. So what did they focus their improvement on? Leadership development, mentoring, viewing the firm as a business and not a professional club, which probably goes back to this business of not being, what I want to say here, not being committed to leadership. And then learning how to improve 360-degree feedback, which was part of what they got into at the beginning. Now, we're close to ending here. But I want to tell you that while I think 360 feedback is good, I think you have to be very careful about it. And one of the reasons you have to be careful about it is occasionally it lends itself to anonymity. And so if peers, for instance, are part of this and peers are unnamed, there's a chance to be, I'm going to stick it to this guy or gal. So you have to be careful about that. Some people will tell you that you're better off leaving peers out because then it becomes a competitive type thing instead of what it's meant to be. So we presented in a little bit of a thumbnail here the difference between revolutionary change, which was done at Dime Bank Corporation. By the way, if you read into the text, Dime was eventually bought out by Washington Mutual, and Washington Mutual had some serious difficulties. Dime Bank had been around for many years. And then this small professional services partnership. And it appears to me that while the evolutionary change was probably best for the partnership, if the partnership really needed to do the things it did, to do those surveys and look themselves in the face, look themselves in the mirror, and say, okay, here's what we think we're doing right, but here's where we are not meeting the mark. And so they did some things that really improved what they needed to do. Well, we've reached a 5:10. I'd like to take I'm going to do a stretch here a little bit, a 3-minute break, 3+ minute break. We'll come back at 5:14 and we will discuss chapter 6, which is organization change, individual, group, and the larger system. So please come back at 5:11. Thank you. Okay, 514, we're back. Chapter 6, levels of organization change, individual, group, or unit, department if you prefer, and larger system. Burke says that change is different within each of these levels. There are levels within levels. Interpersonal, intergroup, interorganizational. So it's, if you would take this, what he's saying here, it's not clean. There's some overlap. That doesn't make it bad, by the way. It's just we have to understand that there is some overlap. So here we're going to talk about the individual level. That's one that we probably can relate to best. Not to say that we haven't seen change in our departments or our units or groups or teams, but we're probably, pardon me, more affected at the individual level. And notice what he says here, that not all change at the employee level helps move the entire system forward, or perhaps even the unit or the group. Now, he also goes on to say there are three things that we can do. Well, three things that we can do, three levels of change. One is the recruitment area, which incorporates other things such as selection. Now, obviously, selection follows recruitment, and then replacing employees. That can be either because someone has retired or because someone has been promoted, and therefore you need to replace or fill a vacancy. And then displacing, which in some cases can be considered termination. It can be considered other things like downsizing or right-sizing, where you have eliminated functions, not necessarily people, and transferred people to new functions. Training and development, remember those two are separate and distinct, although we often speak of them together. And then coaching and counseling. Burke here talks about systematic recruiting, and he really talks about startups. And you know what I want to say here to you is that recruiting is, and strategic recruiting. Now, what I mean by strategic recruiting is going out and finding people for prime vacancies, for vacancies that you have that cannot go unfilled. For instance, a chief financial officer, chief information officer, those positions can't go unfilled. They have to be filled. So you would do some strategic recruiting there. What he says here, among other things, is that by getting, he uses startups, he said, because if you get everybody in at the same time, you really have a good way of inculcating in those folks at the same time the mission, vision, values, and norms of the organization, because everybody gets the same message at the same time. He also talks here about when you do your recruiting properly, I wasn't going to use his word, but that's probably the best word to use. It can do a lot of things for you. It can reduce absenteeism and turnover, and it can lower resistance to change and make you more productive. Now, there are some things that you can think about here, and I've mentioned this in some other ways. I mentioned this when people were responding to the post about scientific management. Fred Taylor talked about making sure that you got the right person to do the job. Well, corporations today, at least in the United States, usually hire on two types of scenarios. One is job-based fit. In other words, the person you want to hire has to have the skills, knowledge, and abilities that match those required for the vacant job. And some will hire based upon organization's values and cultures, organization fit. Toyota does that quite frequently. I can't say Toyota does that across the board in every position that it hires for, and I'm talking about Toyota of the United States, but it does certainly do that for its management people. So you want to make sure that you get the right employee, however you hire, if you're doing job-based fit or organization-based fit. You want to make sure that you get the right employee, because it's very difficult to get the right employee in the first place. In the second place, it's very difficult to replace him or her. Pardon me. And third, it is expensive to do the hiring process all over after you've done it once. So systematic recruiting, you may want to use a different word from that. You may want to use the word that is, instead of systematic, strategic. That's fine. But you have to be proactive in what you're going after, and make sure that you get the right person or persons. Now, here he talks about key replacement and looking for the new leader at the top, and especially from outside. Now, that often happens. Some companies don't do that. Large company here in Cincinnati, Procter & Gamble, its last 3 CEOs, and one of those CEOs came back, were all insiders. They were all Procter & Gamble people for a long period of time. And so whether that is good, bad, or indifferent, I can't tell you. There are people that say Procter & Gamble stock is not as high as it should be. By the way, I don't own any Procter & Gamble stock. I use them as an example because they're a Fortune 500 company and they're headquartered here in Cincinnati, so where the company started. So whether it's necessarily good to do that or not, I can't tell you. What I can tell you is there's a lot of data that says when a new CEO comes in, especially if he or she comes in from the outside, about 20% of the top management will leave within a period of 18 months. Whether that's good or bad, I can't tell you, but if a company can accommodate that kind of turnover without too much turmoil, then it's probably okay. Probably okay because you're bringing new blood and new ways of thinking of things and new ways of doing things. However, to simply change because you want to change isn't necessarily always the right thing to do either. So, if you're a CEO or top management, you probably have the ability to affect change pretty easily, simply because of your position. Pardon me, but that's not always the best thing to do. And displacement, that's talking about people leaving, retiring early, or simply being said, we need to part ways, and that sometimes is a good thing. Coaching and counseling. Please think of these as, and I'm sure you do, they're different things, they're different tactics. Counseling is really more or less getting people to understand what they're supposed to do in some ways. Counseling should be as positive as possible all the time, and you're talking to people about doing things. Now, coaching is showing someone how to do something the right way. And that's why we have coaches for different types of athletic teams, basketball and football and baseball, etc. And they're there to tell their players this is what is supposed to happen in these certain situations. Counseling is entirely different. And so we have to make sure that we do that the right way. Notice how they talk about the difference here. Coaching is align the individual in what he or she wants to do with what the organization wants to do, so that their goals and objectives meet. And actually, it should be, as it says here, the organization's here and you want to align the individual with the organization. You can't do it the other way around. Notice what it says here, that coaching can often be done informally, often done off the job. And you're helping here with employees do certain things. Now, of course, it can also be done formally in meetings, etc., as the slide says. Notice it also says that coaching can help people deal with negative feedback. And yes, I can see that. And if you stop and think about a player in a sporting event, and he or she makes what appears to the fans to be something does something that's entirely stupid, and matter of fact, it could be. And so the coach should get that person and tell him or her, okay, yeah, you did something that wasn't supposed to be right, but here's what you should do in the future, et cetera, et cetera. And by the way, when you're going to coach or when you're going to counsel, you want to focus on the task and not the individual. You never want to focus on the individual. You focus on the task. This is what the task is. Here's what you have to do the task correctly, not on the fact that you made a mistake. Executive coaching has really become a big field these days. And notice he quotes Witherspoon and White on the things that executive coaches do. And you're looking here at coaching for skills, for performance, for development, and then for what the executive's agenda happens to be. And so these are the things that you're doing, and you're bringing that person along, sort of building them out. There's another thing that goes along with coaching, and we sometimes interpose these two as being the same, and that's mentoring. And mentoring is not quite the same as coaching is. Mentoring is taking a person under your wings and helping to break down the barriers that person, or obstacles that person would face if he or she was trying to move up. Some people don't like mentoring. They equate it to cronyism. But if mentoring is done and done correctly and properly, it can really be beneficial to both the mentee, person learning, and to the mentor. Yes, it's probably true that a person who is mentored has a better chance of success than someone who is not mentored. That does not mean that mentoring is cronyism. I don't think that it is. It could be. I won't say that it couldn't be or can't be. But done properly, it's not cronyism and shouldn't be thought of in that fashion. Now, here are some individual responses to organization change that we're going to talk about. Some things that we expect people to have problem with. And notice what this slide says. It talks about imposing change on people. And when that's imposed, people automatically think, well, if that's going to happen, what am I going to lose? They don't look at it necessarily as being beneficial to them. And of course, it may not be. So that's something that you have to pay attention. I mean, you have to remember that we impose change, and sometimes change has to be imposed. I'm not going to get away from that. but there has to be some rationality to it. People have to understand why it's being done, and if they don't, then we need to stop and think about what the issues are. Talks about taking away our crutch, if you will, our familiarity, and putting us into the unknown, opening the door and throwing us out to the wolves. So that's the problem. Notice down here the last thing, loss of freedom of choice. I'm no longer allowed to choose what I want to do because you've imposed it on me. So we have to stop and think about that and make sure we have good strategies in place to smooth over those areas. I'm not going to read Burke's quote to you, but it talks here about people having choice that they have or they feel it to have in implementing the change. And this really boils down to coming down to the person and saying, okay, here's what we want to do, and this is what we need from you. We need your buy-in, and we need you to help us make this change happen. People like to be asked to do things. And when they are asked, and they're asked in the proper way, they're going to respond. At least that's my impression. So here we've got some things that really cause some problems here. We have blind resistance just because. I'm going to oppose this just because. We have people that we know that are againers. If you don't know that word, it means they're against everything. Just ask them and they're against it. They haven't even had a chance to understand what it is, but they're against it. I mean, that's in their DNA. Then we have some here that it mentions it's political. So there has to be some trade-off, if you will, to get these people in. Now, these are saying, also showing you strategies to get these. This blind resistance, that's really maybe the most difficult to deal with because it tends to be ingrained. So does ideological resistance, we're going to get to in a second. So the thought processes with a blind resistance, maybe I misspoke here. Blind is just, I don't know, I'm going to resist it. And ideological is something that's just built up within me. Maybe I kind of misspoke here in how I perceive these. That doesn't mean that I'm right, wrong, or indifferent. And you may look at them differently, and that's fine. So we still have to make sure that we're doing something here. And then notice their strategies here. I'm not going to go into them, but I think that there are things that we can think about. Ideological, you have to be logical to these people. So we have to figure out what this is. And I guess to go back to what I earlier said, the first blind at resistance is I'm just resistant to everything just for the heck of it. Ideological is, well, I'm against that change, and here's the reasons I am. The person that has blind resistance doesn't really have any reason. He or she's just against. Now, notice here what he's saying with this one. We have to really do something here because we have to change the way people think about things. And one of the things we have to do is get them to stop identifying with what was and start identifying with what's going to be or what is. And as long as they keep holding on to this past, if you will, it's going to be very difficult to get them to move forward. So you may have to make some changes in roles and titles and things of that nature. Deal with ambiguity, confusion. We talked about that early on. in change that Burke mentioned it. And people have to learn new skills and new ways of doing things, and perhaps to build new relationships. So the change agent has to be able to articulate all those things. Not change agent doesn't have to do all these things. He doesn't have to say, okay, here and there and something else, but he has to make sure that, or she has to make sure there's a plan to address these issues. Now we're going to talk about the group level, a little bit different, obviously, although, of course, again, individuals are going to be involved. This is he talks about group level, and as you know, you've heard me say before, I prefer to use the term team. I think it's the better term. I think it's the more correct term. Although we do know there are work groups. People work in departments and they work in groups, or that department is thought of as a group, and they're not working as a team. There's that same cohesion, but the team is not there. I still prefer teams, but it's okay if we talk about groups. This is how people interact. They interact with the larger organization either through their work unit group or through a team. This is their socialization, and it is, notice here, and sometimes this is hard to get past. It's how they identify with the organization. They don't always identify with the organization as the organization. They tend to identify with the team or the work unit, and that way they see themselves as part of the organization. Now, one of the things that you want to be able to do is to have a group that works well together. And the best group that works well together is a homogeneous group. That means that they have a lot of commonality. There's a problem with a homogeneous group, and that is that they tend to be insular. It's our way or nobody's way. And they tend to be guilty of what's known as groupthink. Nobody else can possibly think of anything better than what we're doing. So notice what he says, that overly cohesive, overly homogeneous, but that's probably not a good term, overly homogeneous, can have adverse consequences. One of them happens to be turnover, stepping on toes and territories, not invented here, reach the end of its life cycle. So you have to be careful about that. I'm not so sure you're going to have too much turnover in an overly cohesive group, because they tend to hold each other together. Now, if they splintered apart for some reason, I think you could see that. Now, here he talks about self-directed teams, and here group, and he's interchanging group and team terms, and I don't like that. I prefer to stay with, if you're going to talk about teams, let's talk about teams. If you want to talk about groups, we'll talk about groups. That's a pet peeve of mine. I hope that doesn't come through too much as being nasty or smart aleck, but I don't think you should mix and match those. Team members have to learn to share power, and you have to manage skill, ability, experience, etc. And a self-directed team usually has those skills. A self-directed team tries to get team members who have complementary skills. And so they work together, and the person who is the team leader can be one of two things. He or she can be the team leader. In other words, sets the team's agenda, and maybe set the schedule for task completion and things of that nature. Or he or she can be what's known as a facilitator or a resource person to make sure that the team has the resources it needs to be successful. And sometimes that person plays both roles, team leader and resource person. So self-directed teams usually do a pretty good job because they police each other. They have complementary skills, and they need to work with each other. And in most cases, they are trained in some aspect to take over a position for someone who may be out due to illness or vacation or something else. Obviously, you're going to have intergroup, or you can have intergroup conflict. And notice that you have, I think I skipped a slide here. Maybe I didn't. Oh, yeah, right. I did not skip a slide. I apologize. Thought I did. But when you have intergroup, not intra, but intergroup conflict, that means conflict between two groups. And as long as they're motivated to work on a problem, you're okay. But sometimes they're not. So what you have to do is you have to establish an overarching goal for both teams. And once you have that overarching goal and you get people to buy into that, then you don't have the problems. Notice what it talks about. You want to involve these folks in planning and implementing the change. If you can do that, now I shouldn't say if you can do that. When you do that, you're going to find resistance goes down. You won't have people defending their turf. People will come together to work on what needs to be facilitated to make the change happen. People will take ownership of what they're doing to help the change move forward. And they may even ask for new leadership and say, we can't do it this way. We need either to have the person who is the leader now have more responsibility and authority, or we need to make some change here to make sure that we're all clear on what's going to happen. Now we're going to talk about change at the organization level, which is more difficult. This is the order of change refers to the level of the ultimate change target. This comes from Kimberly and Nielsen in 1975. The first thing you want to do is target within the subsystem. The second is the target is a subsystem or a process that is beyond the initial focus. So you want to fix first things first and then move forward. And then last involves, and I want to read this because sometimes it's a little confusing, involve a causal, excuse me, I wanted to say casual, and that's not right, a causal sequence of factors toward the ultimate goal. Now, we are going to now talk about Lewin's famous change phases. Lewin has been around for many years when it comes to change. And he talks about, here he's talking about the system now. All right. So here you have where you are, and it's frozen in time or space or something else. And to start to change, you have to thaw, unfreeze is his term, the system. So you have to make it in such a way that people can see that what you're going to do is not going to come back to where it was. So then once you have this thawed out here, then you're going to have the movement to the new system, the new change, if you will, or to the change. And so the whole time you're doing this movement, the old is still in this liquid state, if you will, this thawed state. unfrozen state as you're moving toward the desired end state. Once you reach that, then you refreeze. You refreeze, or actually, you freeze the new. So refreeze is probably not the right term. I shouldn't argue with Lewin. He had certainly more credentials than I have. But you're not refreezing as much as you are now freezing where you want to be. So it's not a refreeze. I just want you to think about it. It's not a refreeze, because if you refreeze, you're freezing again where you were. So here we are now. We're actually freezing the end state where we wanted to be. I think that's a better way to look at it. But Lewin's stages are unfreeze, movement, and refreeze. Now, we're still here at the larger system, and how do we differentiate what we want to do when we have revolutionary change versus evolutionary? Notice that revolutionary focuses on the big picture. And we may have purpose and mission and vision and strategy and even leadership being changed. And or evolutionary focuses on inner workings, if you will, a little bit differently. I'm saying a little bit differently than what the slide says, but basically we're saying the same thing. Structure, information system, practices, process, procedures, and things of that nature. Things that the outside world may not see. But we're still going to be better at doing what we've been doing for some period of time. More efficient, reduce costs, and still producing world-class products or services, or both. Whereas revolutionary is, we're turning the tables upside down. Okay, change processes. We have some things here that, how are we going to facilitate the change? Communication. Remember, we've talked about this right along. That's critical to the success of any change. People have to know what's going to happen, and we have to do whatever things it is that we need to do to get them on board. We may have to have training programs to teach people new skills. And stopping here, we're only talking about training. We're not talking about development. We probably aren't going to develop people until we get to the new end state. And then we may have to have some interventions. And it talks about down here about survey feedback, etc. Notice what it says here. The change of the larger system is often precipitated by things like mergers, acquisitions, and things of that nature. Also mentions strategic alliances and joint ventures. What the next slide says, what the next bullet says, is most of these don't succeed, especially mergers and acquisitions. One company is acquired and it ceases to be known. I think the classic example to me is when Chrysler was bought out by Daimler. And they had a meeting of the executives of both corporations. They're still being called Chrysler, maybe be called Daimler Chrysler, at the Waldorf Astoria in New York. And all the Daimler executives were picked up in limousines and driven to the meeting. A van was sent for the Chrysler executives. What kind of message was sent? Here's reasons for joint failures. I'm not going to go through all of these, but lack of a contingency plan, lack of perceived equity. And then perhaps one thing there is that I would like to mention is overconfidence, unrealistic ideas. We think we're going to save because of economies of scale and reduction of duplication of effort and things of that nature. A lot of times that just never happens because the thought process is just never, ever run the way it should be. Here's some reasons for organization success. I think a mutual plan is probably good. Committed leader, respect for differences, achieving equity. We really have to understand that. Too often, the people who are bought out, acquired, are looked at as stepchildren. And the thought process is, well, if you guys were so good, why were you bought out in the first place? Maybe not articulated out loud, but certainly thought. Here's again resistance to large-scale change. What happens here? Start out as a revolution and turn out to be an evolution. No sense of urgency. Oh yeah, well, we've done this before, it'll go away. People just do other things to get us off track. Let's not even talk about this. Let's do something else. And last, and perhaps most important, well, probably of equal importance with good leadership, is a lack of followership. And that comes back to communication. If people don't understand the change, don't understand the reason for change, don't see it's going to be to their benefit, they're not going to buy in. It's as simple as that. And these are ways to cope with responses. Achieving closure, we have to say, okay, we've done this before, we're not going to do it again. And then we have to get everyone involved in the planning and implementing the change. Now, I have a little problem with everyone. You probably don't want that many people in at the beginning. But once you filter it out to the other places and there has to be some implementation, some planning done down there, yes, then you want to get everybody involved. Remember, one of the things that you want to do at the very beginning is program something for success. It's easy to achieve and people can see it and they can celebrate it. And then we can go on with ever. Make sure that everybody understands we're going through this, get commitment for it. We're in for the duration of however long this takes us. But there should be some time people understand we're going to reach our end state at this time. This is our desired date of reaching the end state. And then if you have people who are going to try to sabotage us, then yes, we need to deal with those people and deal with them effectively and make sure that they're dealt with appropriately. And I'm not talking about hanging anybody or taking them out and putting them up in a firing squad or something of that nature. But certainly they have to be dealt with and have to be talked to and made sure that people are doing the things that they need to do. Well, we've come to the end of tonight, and I'm going to get the question here for this week. And I did not cover this, and I really meant to, and I apologize for it. But I want you to refer to page 78 and 79 of the text. And in your own words, describe what a learning organization is. And then I would ask you to tell me whether or not your organization is a learning organization and why it is or why it's not. Now, please remember, I don't want anybody to name organizations' names or do anything that causes people to understand that. If you're uncomfortable with saying whether your organization is a learning organization or not, fine. But in your own words, again, this is page 78 and 79, and I apologize for not discussing this because this has become a big deal today for change, having organizations that are known as learning organizations. So the question is, in your own words, what is a learning organization? And again, tell us whether your organization is a learning organization and why it is or why it's not. Well, that brings me to the end. We spent about an hour and a half here tonight discussing chapters 5 and 6. We'll be back next week to do chapters 7 and 8. Thank you for your attention and good night.